In the suffocating heat of July 1863, in a second-floor room of the Confederate White House in Richmond, Virginia, Jefferson Davis sat at the head of a mahogany table and listened to a man destroy his world with numbers. The news from Gettysburg had arrived 3 days earlier. Lee's army was in retreat. Vicksburg had fallen on the Mississippi. The northern newspapers were calling it the turning point of the war. But Davis and his cabinet knew something the public did not. The military defeats, as catastrophic as they were merely symptoms of a deeper, more lethal wound that was bleeding the Confederacy to death in silence. The man speaking was Christopher Memminger, the Secretary of the Treasury. He was Swiss-born, meticulous, and at this moment, terrified. In his hand, he held a telegram from James Mason, the Confederate commissioner in London. The telegram was brief, but its implications were apocalyptic. Memminger read it aloud. Cotton bonds trading at 37. Erlanger demands immediate action. Market confidence destroyed. Credit exhausted. There was silence in the room. Secretary of State Judah Benjamin, normally unflappable, stared at the table. Secretary of War James Seddon's face had gone pale. These men understood what the public did not. The Confederacy was not just fighting a war with rifles and cannons. It was fighting an invisible war on the financial markets of Europe, and it was losing catastrophically. Just 5 months earlier, in March 1863, the Confederate government had issued bonds in London and Paris through a French banker named Émile Erlanger. The bonds were called cotton bonds because they could be exchanged for Confederate cotton at a fixed price while below market value. It was supposed to be a financial masterstroke. European investors would buy the bonds, and the Confederacy would use the cash to purchase desperately needed warships, rifles, and medicine. The bonds had opened at 95% of their face value. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like the South had secured its financial lifeline. European money was pouring in. The Confederate agents in London were signing contracts for ironclad rams and Enfield rifles. Victory seemed purchasable. But now, just 4 months later, those same bonds were trading at 37 cents on the dollar. They had collapsed. And with them, the entire financial credibility of the Confederate States of America had evaporated. Davis asked the question that hung in the air like gun smoke. How did this happen? Memminger pulled out another document. It was a report from their financial agents in Europe. What it described was not a market crash. It was a coordinated attack. Northern agents, backed by Wall Street money, had been systematically short-selling Confederate bonds. They had flooded European newspapers with stories about Southern military defeats. They had spread rumors about cotton quality and questioned whether the Confederacy could even survive long enough to honor its debts. It was economic warfare, waged in the trading floors of London and Paris, and the Confederacy had walked into it blind. The South had believed that cotton was king, that European mills would force their governments to recognize the Confederacy. But what they hadn't understood was that in the modern world, credit was emperor, and the North controlled the credit. To understand how the Confederacy found itself in this financial death trap, we have to rewind to the spring of 1861, to the moment when Southern strategists made a bet that would doom their nation. The bet was called cotton diplomacy, and it was based on a belief that seemed unshakable. Cotton was king. The logic was simple and, on the surface, compelling. Before the war, the Southern states produced 75% of the world's cotton. The mills of Lancashire in England and the factories of France consumed that cotton and turned it into textiles that clothed half the planet. Cotton wasn't just a commodity. It was the oil of the 19th century. It powered the global economy. Senator James Hammond of South Carolina had declared it from the floor of the Senate in 1858. You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king. The Confederate strategists took this as gospel. They believed that if they cut off the cotton supply, the European powers would suffocate economically. The mill workers of England would riot. The French economy would collapse. Britain and France would have no choice but to recognize the Confederacy, break the Union blockade, and possibly even intervene militarily to secure their cotton supply. It was a weapon of economic mass destruction, and the South decided to use it immediately. In the summer of 1861, the Confederate government imposed a voluntary cotton embargo. They stopped exporting cotton to Europe. They wanted to create a crisis to force the hand of the British and French governments. Southern planters burned cotton in their fields to keep it out of Northern hands. They were weaponizing scarcity. But the strategy rested on a fatal miscalculation. The Confederates had no idea what was sitting in the warehouses of Liverpool. In 1860, anticipating possible disruptions, British merchants had stockpiled massive quantities of American cotton. When the embargo hit, the mills didn't stop. They simply drew down their reserves. There was enough cotton already in Britain to keep the looms running for a year, maybe longer. And while the Confederates were congratulating themselves on their leverage, something else was happening on the other side of the world. British colonial administrators in Egypt and India received urgent telegrams from London: increase cotton production immediately. The empire responded. Egyptian farmers, who had been growing modest amounts of cotton, ramped up production. The British Raj redirected Indian agriculture. Within 2 years, cotton production in India tripled. The British had replaced southern cotton with colonial cotton. The Confederacy had assumed European dependence was permanent. They were wrong. Dependence is only leverage if there are no alternatives. And Britain, with its global empire, had alternatives everywhere. By 1863, when the Confederacy finally realized their mistake and desperately tried to export cotton to raise money, the market had moved on. European buyers were locked into contracts with Egypt and India. Worse, the Union naval blockade made shipping cotton dangerous and expensive. Insurance rates on Confederate cotton shipments were astronomical. The South found itself in an impossible position. They were sitting on mountains of cotton that nobody wanted to buy at the price they needed. And the very embargo they had imposed had trained Europe to live without them. Cotton wasn't king. It was a hostage the Confederacy had taken, only to realize too late that nobody was coming to pay the ransom. The weapon they thought would win them recognition had instead isolated them economically, leaving them desperate and cash-starved at exactly the moment they needed to fund a war. The stage was set for predators. By early 1863, the Confederate treasury was desperate. The cotton embargo had failed. The printing presses were running day and night, churning out paper currency that was losing value by the week. Confederate soldiers were being paid in money that couldn't buy a decent meal. The war machine was grinding to a halt not from lack of courage, but from lack of cash. Into this desperation walked a man who smelled opportunity in the scent of blood. His name was Émile Erlanger. He was a French banker, smooth, connected, and utterly ruthless. His banking house, Erlanger Et Company, operated out of Paris and had deep ties to Napoleon III imperial court. Erlanger had married into Southern aristocracy, wedding the daughter of Confederate diplomat John Slidell, which gave him both access and cover. But make no mistake, Erlanger was not coming to Richmond as a friend. He was coming as a vulture circling a dying animal. In January 1863, Erlanger approached the Confederate government with a proposal. He would issue bonds on behalf of the Confederacy in the financial markets of London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt. He would use his connections to market these bonds to European investors hungry for high returns. The Confederacy would finally have access to European capital. Secretary Memminger and the cabinet, staring at an empty treasury and mounting debts, were ready to listen. Erlanger's proposal was elegant on the surface. The bonds would pay 7% interest annually, well above the rate for stable government debt. But the real hook was the cotton clause. Each bond could be exchanged for Confederate cotton at a fixed price of 6 pence per pound. This was critical because on the open market, cotton was trading at over 2 shillings per pound, more than 4 times the exchange rate. If an investor bought a bond and converted it to cotton, they could potentially quadruple their money, assuming they could get the cotton through the Union blockade. It looked like a win-win. The Confederacy would get immediate cash. European investors would get a chance at massive profits. And Erlanger, of course, would take his commission. The bonds were issued in March 1863. The initial offering was for $15 million, an enormous sum. Erlanger's sales force-blanketed Europe with promotional materials. They painted a picture of Confederate victory, of vast cotton wealth just waiting to be unlocked, of a new nation on the rise. The bonds opened strong. They sold at 95% of face value. Money flooded into Confederate accounts in Europe. For a brief moment, Richmond celebrated. They had done it. They had tapped European capital markets. But what nobody in the Confederate cabinet understood was the terms they had actually agreed to. Erlanger's commission was 5% plus expenses, which ballooned to nearly 30% of the total raised. Of the $15 million in bonds issued, the Confederacy would see less than $10 million in actual cash. Worse, the bonds themselves were a trap. By pegging cotton at 6 pence per pound, the Confederacy had essentially promised to deliver cotton at a 75% discount. If investors actually converted their bonds, the South would be giving away its only valuable asset for pennies on the dollar. And there was one more poison pill buried in the contract. Erlanger had the right to support the bond price by buying bonds on the open market using Confederate money. If the bonds fell, Erlanger could prop them up by spending the Confederacy's own cash to buy back its own debt. It was financial genius from Erlanger's perspective. He couldn't lose. If the bonds rose, he made money on his holdings. If they fell, he used Confederate funds to stabilize the market and protect his position. The Confederacy had just signed a deal with a loan shark, and the interest rate was compounding by the day. While Emil Erlanger was selling Confederate bonds in the salons of Paris, another war was being waged in the counting houses of London and the telegraph offices of Wall Street. This war had no soldiers, no battlefields, and no casualties that would ever appear in a history book. But it would be just as decisive as Gettysburg. The architect of this invisible campaign was a man named Jay Cooke. He was a Philadelphia banker, and he had been appointed by Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase to sell Union war bonds to finance the Northern war effort. But Cooke understood something that most people didn't. In a modern war, perception is currency. If you can destroy confidence in your enemy's finances, you can bankrupt them without firing a shot. Cooke had agents in every major financial center in Europe. They weren't soldiers or spies in the traditional sense. They were bankers, journalists, and commodities traders. And their job was to make sure that Confederate bonds failed. The strategy was elegant and brutal. First, flood the market with competing Union bonds. Cooke issued Northern securities that paid comparable interest rates but were backed by the industrial might and gold reserves of the United States government. He marketed them aggressively, painting the Union as stable, creditworthy, and inevitable in its victory. Then, he went on the offensive against Confederate paper. Cooke's operatives began short-selling Confederate bonds in London and Paris. Short-selling is a technique where you borrow bonds, sell them at current prices, and then buy them back later at hopefully lower prices, pocketing the difference. It's a bet that the price will fall, but it's also a weapon. When large volumes of bonds are sold short, it creates downward pressure on the price. It signals to the market that informed investors think the bonds are overvalued. And Jay Cooke's investors were selling Confederate bonds like the world was ending because they intended to make it end. At the same time, Northern agents were feeding stories to European financial newspapers. The Times of London, the Journal des Débats in Paris, and The Economist all began running articles questioning Confederate creditworthiness. The stories were carefully crafted. They didn't sound like propaganda. They sounded like sober financial analysis. They asked pointed questions. Could the Confederacy actually deliver the cotton it promised? With the Union blockade tightening, how would investors get their cotton to market? What would happen to Confederate bonds if the South lost the war? Weren't Southern military defeats at Shiloh and Antietam evidence of impending collapse? Every Union victory was amplified in the financial press. Every Confederate setback was analyzed in excruciating detail. The narrative being constructed was simple. The Confederacy was a bad bet. Meanwhile, Cooke's agents were spreading rumors in the coffee houses and trading floors where investors gathered. They whispered about cotton quality, about Confederate desperation, and about Erlanger's excessive commissions. They planted doubts like seeds in fertile soil. The Confederate commissioners in Europe, James Mason and John Slidell, tried to fight back. They published rebuttals. They gave interviews insisting that the South was winning, that cotton shipments would resume, and that recognition from Britain and France was imminent. But they were amateurs fighting professionals. They had no network of financial journalists. They had no capital to support their bond prices. They were trying to win a propaganda war with speeches while Jay Cooke was winning it with money. And then Cooke played his masterstroke. He had his agents buy up small quantities of Confederate bonds at depressed prices and then publicize the low prices as evidence of market collapse. The headlines in European papers would read, "Confederate bonds fall to record lows." It didn't matter that Northern agents were the ones selling them down. The perception became reality. By summer of 1863, Jay Cooke had done what Grant and Sherman were struggling to do on the battlefield. He had broken the Confederacy's will to fight by breaking its ability to pay for the war. The invisible hand of Wall Street had closed around Richmond's throat, and it was squeezing. The collapse, when it came, was swift and merciless. In early March 1863, Confederate bonds had opened at 95% of face value. By early July, as news of Gettysburg and Vicksburg crossed the Atlantic via telegraph and steamship, the bonds were trading at 70%. Investors were nervous, but still holding. Then the bottom fell out. On July 15th, the Times of London published a devastating editorial. It wasn't just about military defeats. It was a cold, calculated analysis of Confederate finances. The newspaper laid out the math. The Confederacy was burning through its European credit faster than it could deliver cotton. The Union blockade was tightening. Insurance rates on Confederate shipments had tripled. Even if the South wanted to honor its cotton obligations, it physically couldn't get the product to market. The editorial concluded with a sentence that sent shockwaves through every trading floor in Europe. The Confederate cotton bonds represent a claim on an asset that cannot be delivered by a government that may not exist in 6 months. The sell-off began immediately. In London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt, investors who had bought Confederate bonds as a speculation rushed to dump them. The price fell from 70 to 60, then to 50. Each day brought fresh waves of selling. By the end of July, the bonds were trading at 42% of their face value. And then the feedback loop from hell kicked in. As bond prices fell, European newspapers reported the fall, which caused more investors to panic and sell, which drove prices lower, which generated more negative headlines. It was a death spiral, the kind of market collapse that feeds on itself and accelerates until there's nothing left but wreckage. Confederate agents in Europe watched in horror as their entire financial strategy disintegrated in real time. They had contracts to pay for warships being built in Liverpool. They had orders for Enfield rifles sitting in warehouses in Birmingham. They had agreements to purchase medicine, uniforms, and gunpowder. All of those contracts required payment, and the money they thought they had was vanishing as bond prices collapsed. Then Emil Erlanger made his move. In early August, Erlanger sent a letter to Richmond. It was polite in tone, but devastating in content. He informed Secretary Memminger that under the terms of their agreement, he had been using Confederate funds to support the bond price by buying bonds on the open market. But the selling pressure was too great. He had spent nearly $2 million of Confederate money trying to prop up the market, and it hadn't worked. Now Erlanger was demanding more collateral. He wanted the Confederate government to deposit additional cotton certificates to back the bonds. He wanted guarantees. He wanted protection for his own position. The audacity was breathtaking. Erlanger had already taken 30% of the bond proceeds as fees and commissions. Now, as the bonds collapsed, he was demanding that the Confederacy use its dwindling cotton reserves to protect European investors from losses. But Richmond had no choice. If they refused, Erlanger would stop supporting the bonds entirely, and the price would collapse to zero. Every remaining dollar of Confederate credit in Europe would evaporate. Memminger authorized the transfer of more cotton certificates. It was throwing good money after bad, but there was no alternative. By mid-August, Confederate bonds were trading at 37 cents on the dollar. Investors had lost nearly 2/3 of their money. The Confederate States of America was now classified by European markets as a distressed debtor, one step above default. The invisible war was over. Wall Street had won, and the consequences would be measured not in dollars, but in lives, as the Confederate war machine ground to a halt for lack of funds. The Union naval blockade of southern ports was famous. It appeared in every newspaper, every military dispatch, and every history of the war. Hundreds of Union warships patrolling thousands of miles of coastline, choking off Confederate trade. It was visible, dramatic, and undeniably effective. But there was another blockade, invisible and far more lethal. It was the financial blockade, and by the fall of 1863, it had strangled the Confederacy more completely than any fleet of warships ever could. A naval blockade stops ships from moving. A financial blockade stops everything else. In Liverpool, the Laird brothers' shipyard had been constructing 2 powerful ironclad rams for the Confederacy. These weren't ordinary vessels. They were state-of-the-art warships with reinforced iron prows designed to smash through Union blockade ships. If they reached southern waters, they could break the naval stranglehold on Confederate ports. They could change the course of the war. But in September 1863, Confederate agent James Bullock stood in the Laird brothers' office and received devastating news. The shipyard required immediate payment of £120,000 to complete construction. Without payment, work would stop. Bullock didn't have the money. The Confederate funds in European banks had evaporated with the bond collapse. He sent urgent telegrams to Richmond, begging for authorization to transfer cotton certificates, to liquidate any remaining assets, and to do anything to secure the payment. The reply from Secretary Memminger was brief and crushing. No funds available. Delay delivery. The ironclad sat in Liverpool Harbor, incomplete and impounded. The British government, under pressure from the United States and no longer fearing Confederate financial retaliation, seized them. They would never fly the Confederate flag. This scene repeated itself across Europe. In Birmingham, crates of Enfield rifles sat in warehouses, paid for but not shipped because the Confederacy couldn't afford the insurance costs to run the blockade. In France, contracts for gunpowder and medical supplies were canceled because Confederate credit was worthless. European suppliers demanded payment in gold or sterling. Confederate bonds and currency were refused. The financial collapse had accomplished what the Union Navy alone never could. It had cut off Confederate access to the industrial output of Europe completely. Not because ships couldn't get through, but because the South couldn't pay for the cargo. The parallel to Britain in 1940 was haunting and exact. Like Britain facing Germany, the Confederacy was fighting an industrial war it couldn't afford. Like Churchill writing to Roosevelt, Confederate commissioners were sending desperate pleas to European governments, begging for loans, for credit, for any lifeline. But there was one critical difference. Britain had an ally waiting across the ocean with the wealth to save them. The Confederacy had no one. Britain received Lend-Lease. The Confederacy received silence. European investors who had lost millions on Confederate bonds weren't going to throw good money after bad. The French government, despite Napoleon III's sympathies, refused to extend credit to a collapsing regime. Britain, which had abolished slavery in its empire 3 decades earlier, wasn't about to financially rescue a slaveholding rebellion. By late 1863, Confederate purchasing agents in Europe were reduced to sending heartbreaking letters back to Richmond. Captain Caleb Hughes, responsible for arms procurement, wrote, "I am offered every weapon and supply we need, but I cannot purchase them. Our credit is exhausted. Our bonds are worthless. We have been cut off not by the Union Navy, but by the judgment of European markets." The irony was bitter. The Confederacy had massive stockpiles of cotton sitting in Southern warehouses. They had the commodity the world wanted, but they couldn't convert that cotton into credit because the markets had declared them a bad risk. They were asset-rich and cash-broke, sitting on wealth they couldn't spend while their soldiers fought with increasingly threadbare equipment and dwindling ammunition. The naval blockade got the headlines, but the financial blockade won the war. By January 1864, the Confederate financial system had entered its terminal phase. What came next wasn't just collapse. It was disintegration. The printing presses in Richmond ran 24 hours a day, pumping out Confederate currency at a pace that would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. The Treasury had no gold, no silver, no foreign credit, and no way to tax an economy that was being systematically destroyed by war. The only option was to print money and hope. But hope is not an economic policy. In January 1861, when the war began, one Confederate dollar was worth $1. By January 1864, it took 20 Confederate dollars to buy $1. By January 1865, it would take 60. By April 1865, when Lee surrendered, Confederate currency was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Children used it to play with. People wallpapered their homes with it out of bitter irony. This was hyperinflation, the kind of economic death spiral that destroys nations. A soldier's monthly pay of 11 Confederate dollars, which could buy a decent meal in 1861, couldn't buy a loaf of bread in 1864. Officers reported men deserting not out of cowardice, but because they couldn't feed their families on worthless paper. The civil population was suffering even worse. In Richmond, a barrel of flour that cost $6 in 1861 cost $300 in 1864. A pound of butter costs $15. Bacon was $25 per pound. And these were the official prices. On the black market, where speculation ran rampant, prices were double or triple. In April 1863, the women of Richmond had rioted, breaking into shops and seizing food. They called it the bread riot. It was a warning sign that the Confederacy was eating itself alive from economic starvation. And through all of this, the cruel irony hung over the South like a death sentence. They were sitting on mountains of cotton. In warehouses across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, bales of cotton sat rotting. Millions of pounds of the commodity that was supposed to be king, the asset that was supposed to force European recognition, the collateral that was supposed to back Confederate bonds was just sitting there, worthless. The Confederacy couldn't sell it because the Union blockade made shipping too expensive and too risky. They couldn't use it as collateral because European markets had lost all confidence. They couldn't even burn it for warmth because it was supposedly being held to back those worthless Erlanger bonds. It was a perfect encapsulation of Confederate strategic failure. They had weaponized their most valuable asset through the cotton embargo, then found that weapons can be turned against you. Confederate bonds, which had opened at 95 in March 1863, were trading at 15 cents on the dollar by mid-1864. By early 1865, they couldn't be sold at any price. European investors wrote them off as total losses. Secretary Memminger resigned in July 1864, a broken man. His replacement, George Trenholm, walked into an impossible situation. There was no money to pay soldiers, no credit to buy supplies, and no prospects of either. The military defeats of 1864, Sherman's march through Georgia, Sheridan's devastation of the Shenandoah Valley, and the grinding siege of Petersburg were symptoms, not causes. The Confederacy lost those battles because its soldiers were starving, ill-equipped, and unpaid. Regiments dissolved as men walked home to save their families from starvation. The financial defeat had preceded the military defeat by more than a year. By the time Grant accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April 1865, the Confederacy had been financially dead for 18 months. The Army of Northern Virginia was fighting on courage and fumes. Lee surrendered not because he ran out of soldiers willing to fight. He surrendered because he ran out of bullets, shoes, and food. He surrendered because the Confederacy was bankrupt, and bankrupt nations cannot wage war. The invisible war was over. Wall Street had won it, and the South would pay the price for generations. When Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, the guns fell silent. But the economic conquest was just beginning. The North had won the war, but more importantly, it had absorbed the wealth of an entire region without firing a final shot. The South emerged from the conflict not just defeated, but financially obliterated. And into that vacuum poured Northern capital, Northern banks, and Northern control. This was Reconstruction, but not the political Reconstruction taught in history books. This was economic Reconstruction, and it looked less like nation-building and more like a foreclosure proceeding on an entire civilization. The Confederate bonds that European investors had purchased? Worthless. Declared void by the Union government. $15 million in European capital simply evaporated. The Confederate currency that Southern citizens had been forced to accept? Equally worthless. Every pension, every savings account, and every store of wealth held in Confederate paper became ash overnight. But the land remained. The factories remained. The railroads remained. And they all needed capital to rebuild. Capital that the South no longer had. Northern banks, flush with profits from financing the Union war effort, moved into the South like an occupying army. They bought up plantations at fire sale prices from families that couldn't pay their taxes. They foreclosed on railroads and industries. They extended credit at usurious rates to desperate farmers who had no choice but to accept. The system that emerged was called sharecropping, but it was debt peonage by another name. Farmers, both black and white, borrowed money at the beginning of the planting season to buy seeds and supplies. They paid it back at harvest time with interest rates that guaranteed they would end the year deeper in debt. The cycle repeated annually, trapping generations in perpetual poverty. The wealth that had existed in the South, the value of the land, the productivity of the labor, the resources in the ground, didn't disappear. It was transferred. It moved from Southern landowners to Northern creditors. The Confederacy had been liquidated, and the assets had been purchased at pennies on the dollar. Meanwhile, Wall Street emerged from the war as a global financial power. Jay Cooke and the banking houses that had financed the Union victory now had the credibility, the capital, and the connections to compete with London and Paris. The techniques they had pioneered, selling bonds to the masses, manipulating markets, and waging financial warfare became the standard tools of modern finance. The lesson of 1863 was clear and brutal. Economic warfare is as effective as military warfare and often more permanent in its consequences. You can defeat an army and rebuild it. You can lose territory and reclaim it. But when you destroy a nation's credit, when you bankrupt its treasury, when you make its currency worthless, you have conquered its future, not just its present. The Confederacy lost the war at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, but it had lost the war 18 months earlier in the trading rooms of London when its bonds collapsed. The rest was just the slow, inevitable consequence of financial death. Wall Street didn't conquer the South with soldiers. It bought it. It acquired the assets, the land, and the economic control in a distress sale managed by Northern banks and enforced by Northern political power. The special relationship between the North and South after the war was always a polite euphemism for dependency. The invisible hand of finance had closed around the Southern economy, and it would take a century to loosen its grip. I'm Mark, and this is the Economic Warfare Tales channel. Subscribe now, because the wars that shape our world aren't always fought with guns. Sometimes they're fought with bonds, ledgers, and the ruthless mathematics of compound interest. And when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who understood how the real battles were won.